morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are at the beginning of Sefer Devarim. Before we even read any psukim, I want to share with you the Ramban's introduction to the book of Devarim. So it's the first Ramban on the parsha before even pasuk Aleph. HaSefer Hazeh Inyano Yodua Shu Mishnah Torah. This book is known. It's known as Mishnah Torah, literally translated like the run through of the Torah. Yivor bo Moshe Rabbeinu l'dor hanichnas ba'aretz rov mitzvos hatzrichos l'Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu is reviewing in this book most of the mitzvos that the Jewish people are going to need to know. This is the generation that's coming into the land. But it's so interesting because they're going into the land. There's going to be all these obligations for korbanos and the like. He doesn't say a thing about it. Lo b'maser korbanos, not about how the korbanos are brought, sacrifices. Lo b'toaras hakohanim masayim, not about the laws of purity involving the kohanim, not what the kohanim should and shouldn't do. So to the extent that we're going through this review of mitzvahs for the Jewish people, it's striking that there's nothing having to do with the korban service or with the kohanim. Shekvar biero samlahem, because been there, done that. That already has been explained in the book of Vayikra. Now this is a really interesting point. Vakohanim zrizimheim lo yitztarchu la'ashara achar ashara. There's a famous quote the Gemara says about Kohanim. Kohanim are known to be uniquely diligent. They don't need a run through. If you tell the Kohanim that the first time, they don't need a run through. We have at least one. They don't need a run through. Avo b'Yisrael yachzir hamitzvos hanohagos b'hem. But the rest of the Jewish people need the run through. So the book of Devarim is about a general review of these things. Pam lahosif b'en beer. Sometimes it's because there's an aspect that Moshe wants to give greater clarification for. Pam shlo yachziro son rak lahazir sobrov hasaros. Sometimes he's not teaching anything new about a given halacha. It's just urging them again, clarifying again that such and such is prohibited, or warning them. Idol worship. There's a lot of warnings about avodah zarah in this book, and the Ramban is not really necessarily anything new, just really cautioning the Jewish people very strongly. And in general, Moshe Rabbeinu is putting the fear of God into them about committing different sins. There are some mitzvos that will be mentioned in the book of Devarim that have not been mentioned earlier in the Torah. The concept of levirate marriage. There's a whole set of halachos when a husband falsely accuses his wife of being unfaithful to him. Gerushin v'isha, laws involving divorce. Veidim zomim, laws involving witnesses who are proven to be false. V'zulasan. So this is an interesting thing to think about. So I get it that there are certain mitzvos that we're elaborating on further, that there's more warnings about, but how do we wrap our mind around mitzvos that haven't shown up anywhere else in the Torah? This is supposed to be the review. So if this is the review, why wasn't that mitzvah earlier in the Torah? How do we understand that? So Ramban says, Nemru lo kulan b'Sinai, Ramban says we firmly believe that all of the mitzvos that are imparted here for the first time were taught to Moshe Rabbeinu earlier, whether it be at Har Sinai, whether it be in the tent of meeting before the whole story with the spies. The only new thing that was conveyed to Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Devarim is this unique covenant between God and the Jewish people. And it's a new covenant in the aftermath of the sin of the spies. That's the only new thing. We don't have God telling Moshe in this Sefer, tell the Jews this, tell the Jews that, because God already told Moshe all of those things. It's just Moshe Rabbeinu conveying different messages to the Jews now. So if indeed these mitzvos like Yibum and divorce and whatever were taught earlier, why are they only being said now? He says it's possible that maybe these mitzvos that are only being imparted in this book, maybe they weren't in play until the Jewish people came into the land, maybe. Or maybe being that they were only occasional mitzvos anyway, they weren't constant mitzvos, they weren't calendar-oriented mitzvos. Maybe God says, let's wait until we're dealing with the generation going into the land. The term Shiyas Torah, and before Moshe gets into explaining things about the mitzvos as we've been discussing, the first thing that Moshe Rabbeinu conveys to the Jewish people in this book is rebuke and reminding them of their sins. Kama yamruhu bamidbar, how rebellious they were in the desert. And for all of the rebelliousness, how merciful God was to them. And this is to convey that they should understand and appreciate God's kindness for them. There's two reasons why we need to hear about the kindness of God here. First of all, it's just a general perspective, general appreciation of God as they continue the relationship with God upon going into the land of Israel. But secondly, don't mess up again. Do you realize you're only around now by the kindness of God, by the mercy of God? Don't tempt him. That's the second point. And to strengthen their hearts. But there's also an encouragement here that God will always conduct himself towards them with mercy. Because you could imagine a person saying, whoa, it's very nice of God to offer us the land of Israel, but I don't know if we can live on the what's that, the high on a tightrope. Sorry, I don't know if we could live on that tightrope. Maybe we won't conduct ourselves properly. And you're telling us we're going into God's holy land. Maybe we'll get thrown out. Maybe we'll be destroyed because we're not living properly. Moshe Rabbeinu ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu Rachamon Malei Rachamim. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu conveys to them that God is full of mercy. Because this ability and inclination for forgiveness from God is a constant source of assistance to people. Like it says in the pasuk, that forgiveness is with God so that he will be feared. And this is the point, that Moshe Rabbeinu was telling the Jewish people, God has been so kind and patient with you. Don't slack off because you assume God will always just be nice to you. That's a bad idea. But also don't be afraid that you can't assume the mitzvos, or you can't assume the mitzvos in the land of Israel because you'll never do it right. You know what? God's very patient. So emphasizing God's patience encourages the Jewish people to do their best for the mitzvos. Because if the Jewish people don't see God as patient, they'll just give up before they even start trying. So that's the point here according to the Ramban. A lot of interesting things to think about. Okay, let's move on to verse 3. Let's move on to verse 3. Vayihi b'arboim shana b'ashtei asar chodesh b'echad lachodesh. And it was in the 40th year on Rosh Chodesh of the 11th month, which means it's Rosh Chodesh Adar, for those keeping track. Diber Moshe el bnei Yisrael k'chol asher tzivu Hashem oso aleihem. Now Moshe is speaking to the Jewish people. Now is the moment. Why is now the moment? Famous Rashi on Pasuk Gimel. Vayihi b'arboim shana b'ashtei asar chodesh b'echad lachodesh melamed shelo hochichan el samuch lemisa. Moshe only says these words of rebuke in this parsha near his death. Mimi lamad b'Yaakov. He learned it from Yaakov Avinu. Shelo hochiach es banav el samuch lemisa. He only rebuked his children close to death. Amar Ruvain b'ni ani omar lach mipnei malo hochachticho kol hashanim halalu kedei shelo tanicheni v'telech v'tidbak be'esav achi. He was always scared if he would have really hit Ruvain hard with criticism for what he did with the switching of the beds. Maybe Ruvain would have just left and gone to Yaakov's brother Esav. Maybe Ruvain would have just gone off the path. So Yaakov waits until it's at the end of his life. Presumably, Ruvain and all of his brothers feel a different sense of warmth towards Yaakov because he's near his death, and they'll take his words of rebuke in a different way. It's a very famous Rashi. So Rashi says that the reason why Moshe is giving the rebuke now is because he's about to die. Now is the ideal time. Very interesting Sforno over here. Vayihi bar bo'im shana, Sforno on Pasuk Gimel, and it was in the 40th year. Acher shekalu meisei midbar. Says the Sforno, all the people from the previous generation who are going to die have now died. In other words, and one more Sforno, Diber Moshe b'nei Yisrael. At this point, Moshe speaks to the Jewish people, Leboi haaretz. He's addressing himself to the people who are now going to go into the land of Israel. So the Sforno says the reason why Moshe is speaking now is because if he would have spoken earlier, there'd be all these people there who weren't relevant to the message. I mean, they're relevant to the broader message, but his message is, everybody, you're going into Israel. You got to live in this way. But let it be that 100% of the audience are indeed people going into Israel. So Sforno says that's why Moshe is only speaking these words now. An interesting thing to think about. Okay, let's jump into verse 12. This is favorite pasuk by many people in leadership positions. Verse 12, Eicha esel levadi, how can I bear alone? Torchachem umasa'achem v'rivchem. These are difficult words. Moshe Rabbeinu says, how can I bear alone? I'll just try to translate them literally. Torchachem means your trouble. Masa'achem means your burden. Rivchem means your arguments. So this is the context where Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jewish people, it's not going to be just me. We're going to have layers of judges, and I can't do it all alone. It's not good for me to try to do it all alone. But what's meant by these three terms? Torchachem, Masachem, Rivchem. What's meant by these terms? Ramban on Pasuk Yud Beis. V'tam Torchachem, Masachem, Rivchem. Al derech hapshat, Rimeis Moshe Rabbeinu lahem shlosh dvarim she'amar liyisro shayu osel. So the Ramban says he thinks the pshat is that Moshe Rabbeinu is hinting to them how he described his position to Yisro. Kamoshe pirashti sham v'yizkirin liyisrael beremes amar torchachem kineged v'odati eschukeu elokim v'torasav. Your trouble means my role of teaching you the halachos. Kitorach gadol haya l'lamid liyotzi mitzrayim achukim v'toros u'perushim birim v'sodam. Yeah, it's a lot of work to teach all these people all these nuances. Teaching's not an easy job. That's what torchachem is. Next, vizkir masachem. Can I get lidrosh elokim? Shuminyan tefila shemispal aliyim. Your burden means that which I've always davened for you. There were different times in Chumash that the Jewish people are in big trouble, and Moshe Rabbeinu has to be their advocate to God. Okay, v'rivchem kipshuto inyanei hamishpatim. And the meaning of v'rivchem is your disputes, dealing with your disputes, acting as the judge in your disputes. We'll talk more about this topic tomorrow, God willing, but it's just an interesting Ramban. How do you understand what these words mean? So Torchachem, says the Ramban, means teaching you Torah. Masachem means davening on your behalf to Hashem. And Rivchem means acting as a judge for you. We also discussed the Ramban's general introduction to what is going on with the different mitzvos listed in the Book of Devarim, what the purposes of the Book of Devarim in general. And we also discussed Rashi and the Sforno regarding why now, of all times, is Moshe saying his words of rebuke to the Jewish people.